This is Speaking of Shakespeare, a series of conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, recording this introduction from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. The following conversation is with Hirohisa Igarashi, who teaches English language and literature at Toyo University in Tokyo. Professor Igarashi is a very active Shakespeare scholar on the international stage. And today we will discuss his recent research and also explore the directions he takes in teaching Shakespeare in Japan. Before we begin, I should add that this conversation is made possible with the help of institutional educational support from Aoyama Gakuin, and that this series is also funded by a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science called Kaken. And this organization, thankfully, includes support for research in the humanities. Good afternoon, konnichiwa, Hiro. How are you?
Good afternoon, Tom.
Listen, it is a joy for me to see you. And I say this to all the people I interview because we have been restricted from seeing each other face to face. And I normally get to see you at the Shakespeare Society of Japan conference and maybe another conference. And it's
an annual event for us to see each other at Shakespeare conference, and
I know, and we couldn't have it this past year. And
definitely.
So I is happy to see you, and it's also happy for me to see you in my afternoon and your afternoon at the same time. We're in the same time zone. And you're the first, you're our first representative from Japan, Japanese scholar.
Oh, am I?
Yes, so congratulations. Wow. And thank you so much for coming on.
I'm extremely honored.
Yeah, I want to interview more, but this helps to overcome some of the shyness of some of our colleagues who are extremely good, but maybe a little bit hesitant about doing this type of format. It's all new, but so I've had to do this early in the morning for Americans and later in the evening for people in Europe, UK, two speakers, and so it's good to have someone in at my own time, and that's just wonderful. Now, what I want to do before we start, I'm going to ask you about your career and background, but I want to point out to our readers that you have a new translation, a book out. It is the translation of Peter Blayney's work on the Shakespeare
book, but it's new in Japan. Yes, I'm happy.
It's new in Japan.
Translation is finally published in Japanese.
A very wonderful accomplishment to make sure that Blayney's name and his work is distributed in the Japanese language for people who may not run across it. It is not the easiest publication to find, and I got mine when I was studying, doing research at the Folger, and you have a beautiful picture of the Folger Library on the cover here. It's very beautifully done.
Yes, actually, the picture, as you know, is professionally taken by the photographers of the library when Dr. Peter Blayney was still there. And I got the special kind permission from the Folger Library to use that particular picture.
Is he at Toronto now? Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I feel like he's always with us because we typically communicate with each other on the emails nowadays.
Yeah.
Yes, he seems to be living in Toronto. Among Shakespeareans, even in Japan, his name is very famous, but I don't think a lot of students or a lot of larger audiences involved in Shakespeare studies and Shakespeare production in Japan, they do not know him very well. This sort of area of study is not known very much in Japan, and I think in the English-speaking worlds as well.
Yeah, I agree. And it should be better known because it is, once you get into Blayney, the works like this, and also his contribution to the bookshops of St. Paul's, then you start seeing an entirely more expanded, you get a real sense of a small location with those bookshops, and a real sense of how those shops played, the books in those shops played into the theater at that time. And then it brings to mind the greater city of London and how much influence. And a lot of people have written on this, of course, but Blayney's work is a very precise work in the size and shape and location of bookshops was just a kind of revelation for me. You know, I was going to tell our audience here that we're at the end of term, and the Japanese system, I say in every podcast, is a bit different from the system in the rest of the world, particularly in Europe and North America, in that we start our semesters in April. So now we're in the end of January and we're finishing what would be our fall semester. So it's falling on us as professors to grade our students in some cases for a whole year, most of the time now, but for the semester at least. And then at the same time, think about how we're planning our courses next year.
Yes.
So it's a bit of a stressful period.
Yeah, it's a very stressful period in Japan. Also, we need to deal with entrance exams, especially when we are working for private universities. We have lots and lots of channels whereby we take a prospective candidate.
Well, I put in your introduction to this conversation that you are a professor at Toyo University,
Yes.
and not that far away from where I teach. I think
Yes.
that campus, and I came over, and you had invited Sarah Olive to speak, and that's when I first met Sarah. And I thank you so much for bringing her into Japan. And of course, she has interest in the multinationalism, but also East Asia and specifically Japan.
Yes.
And that was a wonderful talk, and it was a
that was a wonderful occasion. And actually, it was not quite often that Toyo University decides to invite foreign scholars, but because, as you know, Toyo University was selected as one of the super global universities by the Ministry of Education. We started putting emphasis on like internationalizing all these areas of studies as more than before. All of a sudden. So we're going to be having more opportunities like that in the future, I hope.
Japan is such a welcoming country for foreign scholars who come in and speak that it's a shame that we don't do more of it.
Yes.
Because once we get them here and get them settled, it's a little difficult. Maybe there's a bit of a culture shock.
Yes.
But you and I and several of our colleagues can make sure that they have speaking engagements, and it's good for them, their exposure, and it's a wonderful. If everyone has done this, has just talked about how wonderful it is and how graciously they have been received by their Japanese sponsors, and we do need to do more of this. Our students.
Yes.
Need more of this. And I think Sarah is a wonderful sort of ambassador because she speaks about education, and she's younger. She can connect with her students, I think, very, very well as other scholars I've invited.
And it gives the students a very good influence as well, because from the students' perspective, having a lesson by a foreign professors entirely in English. I mean, students tend to be very shy in Japan, and they don't know what is going on in English-speaking classes. But after having the first-hand experience by having such a talented professor as Sarah, their how do you say, the psychological filter certainly lowered, and they became increasingly receptive to what is going on in Shakespeare studies abroad, and so on and so forth. They now feel much more comfortable than before after having a professor from away, from abroad. Yes, and I wish we could continue to do that.
Well, I think that there seems to be a push on in our university.
And you know, Aoyama University is luckier than us because they have you as a permanent professor working and teaching Shakespeare. And whereas our department at Hakusan, we do not have a English-speaking expert on. I don't think any other field of English literature has the native speaker of English teaching there.
Yeah, well, you're an English speaker.
I use about 30% English in my class, but because we are so comfortable talking to each other in Japanese, so I naturally switch to Japanese and just speak on and on. toward the end of the class. It's very difficult to keep on speaking English to each other while we know that we could communicate in Japanese with each other more comfortably.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
something.
if you run into trouble
Yeah.
with the English, understanding the English, you can
Yes.
default to Japanese,
Yes.
which I've gotten better at over the years as my Japanese has improved, but not nearly as good as, of course,
Yeah.
a native speaker of Japanese.
Mm.
So that's a great benefit for students. And you sent me, in fact, your syllabus, and I'm very interested because I just finished mine.
Thank you. You know, I just finished writing that yesterday, and
Yeah,
I was just the day
well, very
before,
recently, me too.
yeah.
And we're at that point, that juncture of the year where we're faced with some of the failures of our students.
Yes.
There are always some students, many of my students have done very, very well this year, but a few didn't make it. And I always feel partially like it's my failure. So
Yeah.
then when you're planning the next year, you try to plan for a better class. And it's a little stressful that way because you're
Yes.
up against failure, and then you have to summon the hope for the next year and
Yes.
try to put some new ideas in. And I see that you've done this,
Mhm.
and I wanted to ask you really what the greatest challenge it is specifically teaching Shakespeare to Japanese students. What's the biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge, and once we start teaching, that is when we meet each other in class in April, the beginning of April, where our semester starts. You know, I tend to enjoy teaching, and I think students start enjoying learning Shakespeare. So there's no problem. But the biggest problem, I think, is that Shakespeare as a subject, or Shakespeare as a figure, is getting more and more marginalized in our institution. And English literature in general is getting marginalized in our institutional system. And Shakespeare in particular, for some unknown reason, he's given a label of oldness, maybe, and a lot of professors, even expert in English literature, even they tend to think that Shakespeare is written in Old English sometimes, or medieval English. So that makes the situation a bit difficult that makes it difficult for students to get easy access to Shakespeare.
Mm.
And also when students were still in high school, I think the world history class is where they first encounter Shakespeare, or what they think they first encounter Shakespeare as a big name, as something which represents whole Western history or Western idea, democracy, and all the sort of things. So students tend to be shy away from getting easy access to, whereas, you know, we have better choices, or more apparently easier choices than Shakespeare when, you know, they come to actually choosing between classes. You see, we have Kazuo Ishiguro, we have pop culture classes, we have like what have you. And Shakespeare is placed as one of them. It's very difficult to drag the attention of students. Being a Shakespeare professor doesn't mean that one is like exclusively Shakespearean in the institution. Like, one is also expected to teach general language courses. I even teach TOEIC, if your audience is familiar with that. We teach all sorts of English as a global language. So I'm sort of using the opportunity of teaching these courses to get the interest of students, you see, and drag the attention to just invite them to learn Shakespeare more with me. So that's my strategy.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I do encourage them, if they're having trouble with the English, we slow up and go line by line into English, and I try to explicate it in
Yes.
English, but they're also very welcome to use Japanese translations
Yes. Yes.
to help them along. And my greatest challenge in doing it that way is humor. In some ways, Hamlet is easier than Much Ado About Nothing.
Yes.
And it's almost not worth it how much context you have to bring to a joke like one of
Mm.
the guy playing Dogberry, the constable,
Yes.
makes a joke on the word tedious. He doesn't
Hmm.
know what the word means,
Hmm.
and he calls Leonardo, I think, trying to compliment him. He says, "You're the most tedious man I've ever met," or something to that degree, and that's a joke. He misuses a word, and I think even my very top bright students have trouble understanding how a native speaker would not understand the meaning of an English word.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
very
Yes.
hard to see the humor
Yes,
there.
yes. The class I'm teaching is more like a beginner's level. So before teaching the humor and the linguistic element of the class, I need to first make sure that Shakespeare's English is more contemporary.
Mhm.
Like it's even undistinguishable from modern English, such as like I use, for example, like all sorts of bits and bits of from current English, like from movies or from recent TV show, and just arbitrarily place them together with Shakespeare's language, such as like, yeah, like famous phrases like "all that glitters is not gold," or
Mhm.
or whatever, like the famous Shakespearean line that students should know through their education, and then ask them which one is a quotation from Shakespeare. And then, it makes this obviously like some of the English that we use in modern communication is as formal or as old as sounds more antique than Shakespearean English sometimes. Yeah, that is something I use very often, I do. And then maybe toward the end of the semester, like we have like 15 lessons in one semester. It's very a small amount of classes in compared to English speaking institutions. And at the end of the semester, I think depending on how students learned, I start introducing the minute, the jokes and nuances of the linguistic elements in Shakespeare.
Oh, well, it seems from what I looked over, and thank
Yeah.
you for sharing with me. We don't do this
Yes.
enough, but I'm going
Yes.
to garner some ideas from your teaching in my
Mm.
class,
Mm.
because even though I might have, a small percentage of students who really take on with it, I need to teach to the
Mm.
entire body and a little bit better. That is the way I see it after this year.
Mm.
Uh, and so thank you so much for sharing that with me. And we're looking at a little bit of a break now, and I think that you, and I know I do, might have, after a bit of a rest, maybe some research objectives that we take on,
Mm.
even though we will be brought in from time to
Yes.
time for examinations or the entrance exam. And it can be a little bit of a stressful period for everyone involved. But I have been looking over, along with your translation of Blayney, you have a recent article on Romeo and Juliet and the Ninagawa. You do a wonderful job in that article of explaining how Ninagawa ties in contemporary political concerns at that time
Mm.
with the production and its reception, which is one of your areas. And you and I overlap in our interest in reception of Shakespeare,
Mhm.
all the way through. We'll talk about your interest in the 18th century
Mm.
moment, but
Yes. Yes.
um, that's a very fine article, I think, and shows what can be done, what a great director can do with Romeo and Juliet in terms of fusing, not only crossing cultures but also time and
Mm.
space, really.
Yes.
And you saw that production, and did you come away thinking that Ninagawa had succeeded? Uh,
Well, in general, the production was not good in compared to other three productions of Ninagawa, Romeo and Juliet productions,
yeah.
and other Shakespearean plays. But what I saw in there is the different sorts of, like, Ninagawa was dealing with more of a commercial theaters and internationally known, such as Macbeth or Hamlet or what have you, that the people in the West know very well. But what he seems to have been doing in that particular Romeo and Juliet is going back to his early days in 60s or maybe in 70s, where he was active in the underground, active as an underground director rather than a commercial theater. And I thought this element is something which has never been introduced to the Western audiences. So I just wanted to sort of talk a bit about that. Yes, the political element and how this this whole a movement of all this underground theaters originated in Japan. And
well, he would be along. I don't know how contemporary he was, but Deguchi-san, the Deguchi who did the Jean Theater back
yes,
in the 70s, I believe,
yes,
in Shibuya, and which was a bit underground.
yeah. Were you
And
in Japan when these plays were started?
no,
We were in Hiroshima,
Listen,
maybe.
I came to Japan in '94, so I would have missed most of this. I've just learned about it through my students, really, and then looking at it. There isn't nearly enough out there readily available on these underground theaters as they came from of course, the 60s and 70s. There was a kind of radical, not kind of, there was a radical movement in Japan, and very famously at the University of Tokyo in the 60s. And there was a countercultural movement that was very, very strong, just like it might have been in San Francisco or in London at that same time. And some wonderful creative efforts beyond Shakespeare came from that. But the names that come to me are Ninagawa and Deguchi, and I'm sure you know more who would have been part of that.
Yes. In fact, I do not. I mean, a lot of people know better about Deguchi and Ninagawa than I do in English-speaking worlds already, because I mean, as you probably know, I was in Hiroshima and I was more bookish researcher of Shakespeare, because I mean, Hiroshima, as you probably know better than I do, I mean, Shakespeare is more of a literature than the theater, isn't it?
That's
And
right.
about 10 years ago, after I moved to Saitama, I started seeing Shakespeare in production more. And that was the heyday of Ninagawa, you see. So I know probably much more about Ninagawa, but I less about Deguchi-san's Shakespeare. I mean, the beginning of Deguchi-san's Shakespeare.
Yeah. And just for people who who are outside of the recent history of Japanese politics, Ninagawa-san, the production itself was pretty openly critical of the Abe government that was bringing back in we're trying to set up a military in the old way. And that's about it. And there are many Japanese people who are ardently against having there's a defense force in Japan, but making it a force that could be potentially used for offensive measures outside of the borders of Japan is something that many Japanese people are against. And there's a strong resistance to that. And of course, there are people on the other side who like it. You had a conservative movement to push for a more aggressive military. And then this is part of a kind of mood of resistance against that trend, and it was very intense in 2014, I think. And you were talking about bookishness and Hiroshima. So we have that overlapping thing. I was in Hiroshima from 94 to 99, and looking at your credentials, I think you were later. We did not overlap.
Apparently, I went to Hiroshima just after you left, and I stayed there for 10 years, teaching Shakespeare mainly.
And you were for a period at Jogakuin University.
Yes, the graduate school was in Higashi, Hiroshima at that time, but I was lucky in a way because my supervisor lived in my neighborhood. And
where was your neighborhood?
Did occasional, meetings in my office at Hiroshima Jogakuin University.
Oh, okay.
Rather than myself going to Higashi, Hiroshima, because he was living there, and he for me, it's easier to come to my office to discuss Shakespeare.
That is wonderful that you could do that. And because that commute was not that easy. I lived for a period at Ekimai Dori, and
Yes.
for
Yes.
that's in translation, the road that goes to the station, the road in front of the station, which is usually a main street. Uh, and every night with the Bozo Soku would come by, and it was noisy. And I didn't, when I first got there, I knew next to no Japanese, and you'd have this motorcycle gang, and it sounded threatening. It turned out they're just juvenile delinquents. They're not that threatening, but they make a lot of noise. And then this melody, I would hear this sad melody and think, what an interesting culture here in Hiroshima, in Japan. And the melody was Yakimo Oishi Oishi
Yeah.
Yakimo. And I thought, and then I finally figured out he's selling sweet potatoes. He's not just walking down the street singing a sad song over,
Yeah.
which were very good and very much part of the culture. But we moved to Saijo, which is the same as Higashi Hiroshima,
Yes.
and managed to get Ikenya, a house in the country that was brand new, had been built for the son of a man who wanted his son and daughter-in-law to live close by, and that son was transferred to Tokyo. So it cost next to nothing to live in this beautiful sort of Totoro style area and still be only 5 minutes from the university. Those are wonderful years. 3 years we lived there. You were in Bungakubu, which is the Department of Culture.
Yes, I was going to the Bungakubu of the Hiroshima University.
Bungakubu would be humanities. And
Yes.
Hiroshima University would be a very, very fine place to study. It's an elite university in Japan.
Yes.
And there's some very, very fine people there. And I think it's considered maybe in the area of education, one of the strongest universities in all of Japan. And of course, in humanities. I was in Sogo Kagakubu, integrated arts and sciences. And they loaded us up with, as you were talking, with English classes. So we did get a Senmon or specialty class. And there were some really fine people in that department when I was there. You were at Ritsumenkan for your undergraduate, another very, very fine university. And is that where is your home?
My home.
Yes.
In Saitama at the moment, but I kept moving. I mean, until I was 18, until I was at high school, I was in Fukushima.
Yes.
Close to here.
And you were up north for a period, I think, if I'm reading, didn't you go?
Yes, after I did my first degree at Ritsumeikan in Kyoto, I went up to Hokkaido, where I stayed about, I think I was 5 years, yes.
Yeah. So you're trans, you have this trans-Japanese experience from the north to to Kyoto, to Hiroshima.
The only reason I left Kyoto is because I did not have an air conditioner working in my apartment. And
that's
the
a reason.
Could get, I mean, if you have been to Kyoto, the summer there without air conditioner is just a torture. It's hectic and
it's murderous. And
I saw the ad of Hokkaido University Graduate School before the faculty office, and I was fascinated. I just went up north in summer to take the exam, and there you go. And that's the only reason. And I wanted to be more like relaxed and free. I was pretty much interested in Shakespeare already at the end of my undergraduate days, but I knew that going to study Shakespeare at graduate school is no good in a kind of set environment. And Hokkaido University did not seem to have a expert on Shakespeare, so I thought that I could study freely.
You came through the Japanese school system, so by the time you went to college, you knew that you were going to be in the School of Humanities in Bungakubu. But when did you figure out that you were headed into that direction rather than a STEM subject or science and technology? Because I'd say the majority of men go into those areas, probably because they feel an obligation. Or,
Yeah, up until when I was a third grade in Ritsumeikan, I was more interested in Pacific Rim studies, Pacific Rim region studies. In those days, this was a big subject there, political sciences, international relations, and so forth. Although I was in the English department, I studied Shakespeare. I studied Shakespeare in a very classic way. I never I got interested in that. But I was trying to be away from the English department, so I decided to go to Canada I mean, there was a good exchange program at Ritsumeikan with a University of British Columbia in Vancouver. So I joined that program and tried to be away from Shakespeare and English literature to look for something more interesting. But I peeped into one English class there, which was Shakespeare. In Japanese school, they tend to enlarge what is difficult in Shakespeare to, I don't know if you were exposed to that situation, but in 90s and 80s, Shakespeare study was taught by prestigious professors. I don't know, I do not say who, but I mean, they tend to be taught by well-known professor, and we were expected to sit quite quietly until we're told to speak up. And what we were expected to do is to read each line accurately and translate that into accurate Japanese and explain why we did that and so on and so forth, which is not interesting at all for undergraduate students. So that was the reason I hated English literature. But in Canada, obviously, that sort of things are not simply there. Shakespeare is well, it's a national subject, and at college level, they are freely they're expected to discuss from their own perspectives and exchange their ideas and quite freely in class. And I just liked that atmosphere. And I was even got fascinated by Shakespeare. I actually read more Shakespeare than I did after I came back. I read almost all 37 works when I was in Canada. And the first because there was much time during a weekend, and also more people who can talk about Shakespeare in Canada, in different places. I mean, Shakespeare could become a common topic to start talking to each other and so forth. So I got fascinated and I read more and more. I enjoyed Shakespeare more and more, and decided to study Shakespeare after I came back to Kyoto. So I just knocked on the door of a young professor who was then studying, Professor Noguchi, the gentleman who translated 18th century Shakespeare with me later on. I mean, he was very young and fascinating in those days. And I just knocked on his door and asked him to get me into his seminar to study Shakespeare. And he said, "Yes, you're welcome."
Yeah.
Yes, that's
what great timing! What great timing
Yes.
that you could find Noguchi, Professor Noguchi.
Yes,
at
he
that
was
time in your life.
Yes.
So that's the pivotal moment. That's when things really came together.
Yes.
And you were for a period at Queen Mary College in London, I think.
Oh, you know very well. Yes.
Yes. And so you studied also in London. So quite a lot of international experience, Victoria and London, and then
Vancouver.
Vancouver.
Yes,
And,
also Victoria later on. I took 1 year sabbatical and studied.
That's where I'm getting Victoria from. I was
2007, just before I left Hiroshima.
Yes.
Yes, I spent my last sabbatical from that university, and yes, that was Victoria University in BC.
Yes. How was London? How was that experience?
Yeah, it's short. It's just 1 year and a little bit. until I finished my MA. Actually,
Yeah.
I wanted to stay longer, but we got married and everything. So the situation necessitated me to come back to Japan afterwards. So I only stayed there for MA, and that's it. But busy time. Yes, I wished I had been in London before, and maybe as an undergraduate student or as a PhD student, so that I could have more freedom exploring the city.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I spend most of the time in the library reading, preparing for. I mean, it's not a good idea. I mean, I do not criticize British education system, but it's not a good idea to cram students with too much work to do. I mean, it's more like a high school student in Japan, where they're all expected to read just to take the entrance examinations. But for the MA student in England, I mean, they're expected to read from the fixed, reading lists, and students, consequently, they do not seem to have more freedom. Whereas in Japan, like we have too much freedom, maybe. As an MA student, we are given 3 years to consider deeply what to think about first, and then start writing an MA thesis and so forth. But I mean, we are not properly directed, though.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe something in between British education system and Japanese education system should work.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that you work in that in between space, and I try to also, the space in between ultimate freedom and too much rigor, and to try to direct students, but also allow them to think on their own. And when it works out very well. Some students expect a lot more direction,
Yes.
and others want to take their own course of maybe a little bit too much. They get too general. What was the joke? I had just in a basic, what we call integrated English in our, I had a student there who wanted to write what was basically a short report. And she says, I want to write about Africa. I said, you're going to have to get a lot more specific. Africa is a very, very large place. Start with choosing a country and maybe a period of time, and do a little research into that. But anyway, so I'm interested in how you got interested in the 18th century reception of
18th
Shakespeare.
century, yes.
What led you into that direction? Because that's fascinated me too. Was it from a professor you were studying with, or was it from Noguchi sensei?
Well, I got interested in that field after I started teaching Shakespeare. At first, I was 27 when I started teaching Shakespeare at Hiroshima Jogakuin, and I didn't know what I was expected to teach and so forth. All of a sudden, like a predecessor retired, and the course was given to me, and that was titled Reading Shakespeare. And apparently, reading the syllabus of my predecessors, I was kind of expected to read into what Shakespeare was thinking, or like as Dr. Johnson was perhaps teaching David Garrick, perhaps what Shakespeare was thinking there and there. That was something that was typical in Japanese schooling. And I was thinking that, I mean, Shakespeare does not really exist, doesn't it? I mean, Shakespeare is something that we keep creating on theaters, in bookstores, maybe through pop cultures and everything. So I was interested in the way in which I can introduce how Shakespeare was being created, how Shakespeare, as Shakespeare we study, was created originally. And I thought I needed to go back to the 18th century rather than the 17th century, because that's when Shakespeare's image was really created, Shakespeare as the national poet. And Shakespeare, as you know, is a big figure in English literature in Japan, but that goes back to the 18th century image. And we did not know, and we still don't know how Shakespeare was regarded by the ordinary people or scholars or theatricals in the 17th century. Like, we don't exactly know. But we know that we could know that how Shakespeare was created through textual studies or theatrical environment and so forth in the 18th century. And that is different, obviously different from what Shakespeare was or what Shakespeare could have been in the 17th century. So I just wanted to start studying that. Although, I mean, I know that in the West, it's a too basic a subject to do as a graduate student or as a scholar. But for a teacher teaching for Japanese students, it's a very important. And I decided that, we're sharing the same interest. I mean, with Professor Noguchi, we're sharing the similar interest, and he was teaching Shakespeare for his students in Ritsumeikan at that time. He decided to sort of start studying that area from, David Nicol Smith's Shakespeare in the 18th century.
Yes, well, they put Shakespeare together as a body.
Yes.
And branded Shakespeare.
Yes.
And they did so in a way because the editors of Shakespeare were so prestigious themselves, established poets and writers like Johnson and Pope. And I guess I think it started with Nicholas Rowe, and they felt a little bit more freedom to change things, but they inherited all of these quartos with all of the textual variants in the body of Shakespeare's work.
Yes.
First Folio, and had that incredible task of trying to intervene and decide themselves what was the best version.
Yes, and at the same time, Jacob Tonson, the bookseller, was trying to sell Shakespeare, trying to make money out of Shakespeare, right? And
and pushing
I don't know what exactly Alexander Pope was thinking, but he was obviously trying to improve Shakespeare's language. And he was on the belief that 18th century English is much better than 17th century and sophisticated English and so forth. And Nicholas Rowe, he was doing that from the perspective as a drama director himself, drama writer.
Yes, and changed famously the ending of King Lear, which to this day, I know you have King Lear on your syllabus, but I've gotten to the age, where I just can't take it anymore. I can't take everybody dying, and the idea of Edward and Cordelia maybe being married after all of this tragedy, all of this screaming on the heath and madness and so forth. I'm sorry, Edgar. And to have something good at the end, I think works a little bit better because it's so punishing,
Yeah, for me though, it's more interest. I mean, what's interesting about that comment, I think you share the view with Dr. Johnson. But I don't know why, like Western people tend to think that the death of Cordelia is intolerable. As a Japanese, we are not religious, we just take what it is as it's partly comical. I wouldn't say it's a travesty, but we do not read any Christian meaning or anything in there, and particularly. I don't know.
I think you're right. And I think that maybe it's that, I don't know, I grew up in post-World War America, and I didn't suffer some of the things that people throughout history have routinely suffered, the devastation of wars, of bad economies, of disease and so forth. And people are just tougher in some cases because they've experienced in their own lives these kinds of great tragedies. So, but it's an exhausting play to see in performance. It is. It really challenges you. Although I think from a poetic standpoint, and I think you probably agree because it's on your syllabus, in terms of poetry and its literary value, if you had to pick one play and nothing outside, I think it would be Lear. The poetry there is just unforgettable and outstanding, and the nature. And I think that's another thing that attracts maybe the Japanese traditional mind, because of the connection traditionally between Japanese culture, the nature that comes into Japanese culture, and the relationship with nature. Might be something that someone born and raised in Japan might relate to very quickly.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, actually, I will be reading King Lear after 25 years now. The first text I taught when I was 27 was King Lear with enormous difficulty. So I was kind of trying to be away from the text, but I chose the text because of the world situation rather than my strong interest in King Lear. But I gave it a challenge again, and I'm going to ask students how they feel about the ending of King Lear, especially in comparison with Tate's happy ending version, and etc. I'm kind of looking forward to having students' comments on that. My sensitivity is weakened after living for a long time. You see, I'm looking forward to hearing students' comment. But yeah, and I also am interested in having views from the students in the West regarding the ending of Lear, though.
I could talk about Lear for
Yeah.
hours, really. But you're also interested in law in Shakespeare, as am I.
I started studying, and I'm supposed to be into that subject by now. But rather than law specifically, I'm more interested in legal situation after King James came to England.
Mhm.
That's when Lear was written, and Measure for Measure was written. Is I'm kind of interested in situation of the changes regarding the consciousness of the common people or the intellectual regarding this legal issues. Yes.
Well, Martin Ingram was invited a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, to the Shakespeare Society, and he has
Oh,
recently
yes, yes.
published a book. And I was trying to write an article that I never finished, and I remember asking him about law, and he knows everything
Mm.
because he studies the
Yes,
way, of course, sex. He's interested in
yes,
sex, and
yes, and
that takes
marriage,
you
and
straight to
yes.
women and how the law was so forceful
Mm,
against
mm,
women and how it
mm.
worked. Uh,
Yes.
and of course, Shakespeare famously didn't think much of lawyers, uh,
Mm,
and of course, Hamlet. I've read an article fairly recently about the legal elements of Hamlet in terms of estate and inheritance and
mm,
all of the various things. And I never realized how much law was in
mm,
Hamlet. And it certainly suggests that Shakespeare knew quite a lot
mm,
about
mm,
that.
mm.
And of course, the London theaters are right there, and there's some productions right there with the Inns of Court, and where lawyers were trained. And so I guess that would be an attraction. This takes us to bibliography. We talked a little bit about bibliography. That was my advisor in graduate school was a
Mm.
Trevor Howard Hill uh, was a bibliographer and kind of a front runner in the uses of computers,
Yes.
so forth, in compiling bibliography. And I think one of maybe his great accomplishment was the British bibliography of bibliographies. I wasn't quite into bibliography that deeply,
Mm.
but it shifted my thinking. Uh, and I remember he taught a class when there are 8 of us here. He says, I have 8 problems, and I'm doing too much right now, but I have 8 problems. If you research this problem and you work with it, you will publish on it.
Mm.
And everybody did. Everybody, because no one had seen this. He was so deeply into
Mm.
not just Shakespeare, but all of the printed books of that period. But it was, in his case, very rigorous study.
It's quite difficult, isn't it, as a person who is quite away from the central core of the discussion to delve into that area of studies. I
Talks about,
am
yeah,
quite interesting how books were made and how books have been descended to us and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I'm also interested in hardcore issue bibliography from the perspective of Shakespeare as being appropriated through the culture of publication. I mean, in my mind, it's always connected with Shakespeare coming from the bookshop and Shakespeare on theater and Shakespeare cannot live without being appropriated to various forms. So the making of a book is one thing, while creating theater is another. Shakespeare is somewhere in between. So my interest is in the bibliography is because of that the reason.
It's a fascinating history when you back away from the many titles a little bit and see the flow of the publishing industry and how that drove text. And I think I'm right in saying in the 18th century, they still would try to get subscribers in advance for a lot of these fine editions that were fairly expensive. And then gradually towards the end of the 18th century, and certainly by the beginning of the 19th century, paper became cheaper. The Industrial Revolution had hit, and you could get these mass editions coming out, just churning out. And they found that Shakespeare by that time sold because the public, there was a larger reading public out there, better education.
And when you look at the Nicholas Rose edition, you can see that its octavo volume is fairly small compared to like a folio of Shakespeare that was, the predecessor of that edition. And we can see that how Jacob Tonson, the bookseller, was trying to, appeal to wider audiences, and how you can see how, the ever increasing numbers of people buying the book and learn Shakespeare through, I'm speaking off the top of a head. I mean,
that's where ideas start. We may revise them later, and I may see something and I go, I wish I'd added that when I was talking to Hiro. I wish I had not said this, but this is how we think. I mean, and we have been not able to have these conversations where we can walk away and refine our thoughts. Do you look into Japanese bibliography, Shakespearean bibliography at all, say from the Meiji period?
Not professionally, but I'm interested in how the image of Shakespeare has changed, not through bibliography, but as a whole, through Shakespeare's image. In Meiji, he was called Sao rather than Shakespeare, which means Master Shakespeare, isn't it? And rather than just simple Shakespeare. No, Shakespeare was a great figure. I mean, O implies that this poet is a great figure. But we just simply call him Shakespeare, or more casually nowadays. And Shakespeare wasn't he a more like a literature rather than Shakespeare as a theatrical figure?
I think if you followed Shakespeare through the 18th, 19th century, depending on how large the middle class is in various areas, it's primarily, at first it's primarily England, London. Then it jumps to Germany pretty quickly and becomes international. Of course, with the migration, Shakespeare, Milton, the Bible, probably those three books. But the big leap from being basically a kind of popular figure was when Shakespeare began to be taught at first in night schools, almost like a Senmon school in Japan, for people who were from backgrounds where they couldn't learn Greek and Latin and go to Oxford or Cambridge. And it was felt, Matthew Arnold felt very strongly that Shakespeare would teach them enough about their cultural beginnings and be enough to cultivate these people who were poor. But it made its way into American universities. And according to my research, the University of Tokyo, which means Japanese universities, before making it into Oxford and Cambridge. It was considered a little bit beneath the powers that were at Oxford and Cambridge, whereas the Americans at Harvard started teaching and at University of Tokyo. And I think that's when the academic image or the class, the idea of a kind of smug, higher class Shakespeare really took hold, because universities at that time, and specifically those universities, were places for young men from the right families. They weren't extraordinarily democratic institutions. So they sort of, I think, gave Shakespeare that type of image of the upper classes.
Yes.
And
but have you studied the situation of Shakespeare in Japan before it was being taught in university? I think Shakespeare was more like a more proletarian figure. I don't know. I haven't checked exactly who brought Shakespeare to Japan first. Is it Tsuda Umeko or the major figures anyway who went to the States? Not
Yeah.
from Britain. In those days, Shakespeare was not treated as a big figure. I haven't checked, but the major figure, Tsutematsu Yamakawa from Aizu, Fukushima, she was one of the early Shakespearean in Japan. Although she did not talk about Shakespeare, but she did belong to Yale University's Shakespeare Society
Yeah.
when she was studying there. I mean, she was not studying there as an exchange student, but she, after Aizu lost the war and everything, she had to leave here and, was spending a certain period of time over in the States. And that's when we encountered Shakespeare, like for the first time after major restoration.
And then there was the Shingeki, and I haven't done enough research into Shingeki to new theater that very purposefully tried to fuse traditional Japanese theater with what they saw as this new Western theater,
Yes.
and then pull Shakespeare into the mix. And from what I understand from reading, did some very interesting productions of Shakespeare, but I'm not sure how elite the new theater productions were, whether they were open more to the middle classes.
And Shingekis were appealing to the middle class audiences, wasn't that? I mean, in the 60s and 70s, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
before whole movement of Angra theater happened.
And a sense of trying to cut down what we call the iconic Shakespeare, to take Shakespeare off its pedestal and say, here's what we can do with these dramas that, by the way, are it's abundantly clear that they're not focused just for aristocrats.
Yes.
There are a lot of aristocrats there, but these themes and the movements and the human emotions that everybody feels, and even in the poetry and so forth, that a reasonably literate man in the 16th or woman in the 16th century would have access to these things. They did not have to come from either extremely well educated or certainly not an aristocratic background. And I think people figured this out, and there was probably a boom after the 60s and 70s, and a sort of, and I think you kind of see some of that present in the Baz Luhrmann production of Romeo and Juliet, where he just goes over the top, just makes this part of the kind of a gang culture with all the guns and shooting and so forth. And that's fun. That's fun. And maybe he's getting close to the spirit of what those bad boys were doing in Romeo and Juliet. They are essentially
I like the production. Yes.
Sort of like the children of very rich men who may not have made their money in an exactly legal way, so they're second generation bad boys out there fighting on the streets. That led me to do as much as I could, looking into riots in London and how frequent the riots were. We think of Romeo and Juliet, and my students do when we start, as this love play, and we're going to talk about love, and it starts with the street fight. And of course,
increasingly, like students are associating Romeo and Juliet with violence nowadays rather than romance.
We're talking about performance now. And I have a graduate student who's working on performance, and she has an extreme interest in how Shakespeare is appropriated, and of course, is part of the younger generation. And I think she's on the verge of showing the argument that Shakespeare is becoming, at one and the same time, the traditional, or what we kind of the iconic Shakespeare continues, but then there's this whole layer of different types of productions that are much more open, that they belong for children, for
Yes.
university students who are not trying to impress their parents, that
Mm.
actually want to go out and have some fun
Yes.
seeing a Shakespeare play, and that there's a kind of openness that is coming. So the iconic status, you can take it or leave it in a way, and that's becoming more easy to do. Is basically the direction she's on now. And I think considering ideas maybe for the future, maybe beyond me, beyond my time on this earth, where a type of literary study can be introduced to Japanese secondary school, to middle and high schools.
Yeah, that is what I'm interested in at the moment. Yes, unless we are getting the attention of younger generations, we cannot continue teaching Shakespeare at college level.
Yes.
And there are a lot of sources for younger children. I mean, when our kids are smaller, we used to let them watch the cartoon show called Anpanman. It's a very popular show, if you know that. And whole story is based upon Romeo and Juliet. It's enmity between a fungus and bread, and the offsprings were in love with each other, and that sort of things.
Anpan being bread. And in the spirit of Japanese concern toward the health of children,
yes,
it really harks back to after World War II, when bread was something exotic. Everything was rice, so they had to have a public campaign to encourage students to love bread.
And looking at that cartoon, you see a lot of allusions to Shakespearean plays. Actually, the show uses Shakespearean language at various points. So students, and I mean, small kids in Japan have exposure already at the age of 3 or 5, to Shakespearean language and also Shakespearean situations.
I've never thought of Anpanman, but Anpanman, but my son loved it when we were in Hiroshima.
Just read the whole, read or watch Anpanman series with your children. I mean, you find a lot of Shakespearean allusions. I once gave a task to my students to find allusions of Shakespearean plays from Anpanman shows. And they came up with a lot of examples. And, I believe there was a character who is called Hamletto. And it's obviously it's a parody of Hamlet, and he soliloquizes like to be something equivalent to be or not to be. He's a really melancholic figure.
I'm going back 25 years now. To Hiroshima, where I knew I was still at very, very basic Japanese, so I probably didn't pick that up. When my son, of course, when you're 3 or 4 years old, you learn a language in 20 minutes. He was just transfixed. And by the way, he learned a lot of language from watching anime and those kinds of cartoons.
Yes. And also, if your children saw an NHK show, Nihongo de Asobou, the playing with Japanese language, done by Nomura Mansai. Wasn't he saying Yayakoshiya, Yayakoshiya? That is deriving from Takahashi Yasunari sensei's adaptation of Comedy of Errors. So the language is not exact translation of Shakespearean word, but if one learned Japanese through that NHK show, it means that the Japanese people are learning even our language through Shakespeare.
Well, I'm working on an article now with my student and Matsuyama Sensei. Matsuyama Sensei is very
yes, he knows a lot about
anime.
Anime and Shakespearean moments in anime.
That's right. The Blast of Tempest, I think, is how it translates. And she knows all of these things. I have no idea. We're working with the idea for a short article on Asobi Gokuro, which would be playfulness. But it's a very difficult to explain in English exactly how that Asobi that you brought up is very much so it just threaded through Japanese creative arts, and using that as a theme. And I think we should look at the wordplay games that you just talked about, that my daughter actually would play endlessly with her Japanese friends, where you say a word and the last syllable of the word has to be the first syllable of the next word. So, and they would just go on and on and on.
Yeah, yeah.
And how wonderful that was for her vocabulary building in Japanese, and getting what we call a functional vocabulary, making it part of how you speak rather than words you understand, words that you use. And there's so many wonderful educational tools, particularly in early childhood education in Japan. It's just outstanding. I think
Yes.
I don't know every system in the world, but it's got to be one of the best, if not the best. So, and I hear that from my colleagues and my friends who are Japanese, maybe critical of high school sometimes, or, the strictness of the high school curriculum. But it seems that everyone up to the end of Shogaku, the sixth grade in America, elementary school, has these wonderful memories from that period.
Yes.
And something to be imitated. But getting back to Shakespeare, though, when you start looking, you see these hints, and I think it's something that would be good for particularly Japanese scholars and young scholars to examine. And one of the big key words now is appropriation, cultural appropriation, which is considered bad. But other scholars are saying, no, just because it's appropriated. I mean, how do you do anything in drama without appropriating something? And so it's an interesting theoretical area too.
Yeah, the Shakespeare himself seems to be appropriating Bibles and his original stories and everything. So why don't we, keep on appropriating Shakespeare to various platforms, various cultures, and
Italian stories, French stories, or stories that were appropriated from the Italian to the French to the English. I mean, they were doing this long before Shakespeare was being imported to Japan. And the challenges of translation, which is the next thing I want to ask you about, because when you're translating a scholar like Peter Blayney into Japanese, what's the challenge there? Not just Shakespearean language, but you're translating scholarly language into Japanese. Is it easier or harder than translating Shakespeare into Japanese?
Well, first of all, I'm not good at translating literary language such as Shakespeare's, and I'm also not good at translating scholarly language. But yes, it's difficult, yes, because sometimes when we talk about something that is not existing in Japanese culture, especially the terminologies or way we call each part of the book, for example, the words simply do not exist. And even if they exist, it's difficult to, I mean, it's not common. So we have to sort of change the ways of expressing each scholarly language to intelligible words and phrases. So it's a difficult part, I think.
But I think most of the colleagues I've had were talking about Tomiyama Sensei, who translated, I think, Derrida into Japanese. And of course, I can't think of anything more difficult than a French post-structuralist theorist trying to translate that person into any language. But then there's I think a wider gap when we get into character-driven languages like Japanese or Chinese, and so I am not good enough to evaluate the level of your translation, but from what I've seen so far, it looks fine to me. And I do not consider myself an expert, but it's a wonderful sort of thing, and I'm glad that you did it. That brings up the question in terms of the theater. Do you think there should be more of a movement to produce Shakespeare in English on the stage in Japan, or can you just not succeed unless you use the native tongue?
Well, it's I don't know. I mean, in modern English, you mean, or like
Yeah, that's the
English?
question, isn't it? Production.
Shakespeare is done entirely in English. It's only, I mean, the present moment. I mean, if you look at the college students, it only bores the audience, I think,
Yeah.
unless you use a lot of visual images or like some other techniques other than language to communicate the feelings of each scene. Translating Shakespeare into Japanese is, I think, it's a good means to good ways of I mean, showing Shakespeare. And I mean, I don't know if we think of how Shakespeare might have been done in 17th century, though. I mean, did people understand Shakespeare's language? I mean, except the aristocrats and intellectuals who might have understood all that's been said. I think that a lot of the audiences were relying heavily on the non-verbal expressions, or a lot of Shakespeare's are actually allusions to Bibles, for example, and the audiences could relate their experience of the Bible to get into what's, you know, to what's going on stage. But we are not living, I mean, not sharing the same culture as the 17th century England in Tokyo, for example. We need to, well, we need to give it up, for example. I mean,
I think that yes, between the publication of some of the earlier quartos and
us.
plays from the 90s, and
Mm,
then there's a 20-year plus gap until you get to the first folio. I think you could argue some of the editorial changes that I've seen in the first folio are done because the issue is no longer contemporary 20 years later. So, and it might not be.
and also First Folio and Shakespearean texts in 17th centuries are specifically targeted for the intellectual audiences. I mean,
Yeah,
those who were able to read at least and
yeah.
enjoy play through reading. But Shakespeare in theater, I mean, it's got to be appealing to the illiterate audiences as well.
Yeah, or the semi-literate, the people.
And even looking at Romeo and Juliet, we could see which bit is, you know, I mean, for example, the beginning of Romeo and Juliet is full of slangs, and that is written in the language which may have been familiar to the a group of audience sitting in front of the stage, for example. Whereas when Prince Aeschylus came to start speaking a verse for the first time in the play, you know, the audiences in the groundling could perhaps understood the whole feelings of what's being said, but may not been able to follow what is actually spoken by that high language. It also happens to Japanese audiences. Like, I mean, slang bits in the beginning, I mean, it's difficult to follow in Japan.
A lot of things have come out here because we're talking, number one, about the changes in idiom and also in social changes that may have happened over 20 years of the early textual history of Shakespeare. And we're talking about jumping that into English speaking society 200, 300, 400 years later, where, you know, when you get to our time, all of the horse jokes, unless you're very familiar with the etymology, I think in Much Ado, Beatrice says that Benedict always used a jade's trick, a jade being a horse, and the jade's trick being when the horse gets out of the bridle by shaking it and getting out of a conversation that way, you know, just saying, I'm finished. But I don't even try to explain that now. It takes too long. And I would have to do the same explanation in California if I were teaching there. And then starting to move Shakespeare to other languages. You asked a very pertinent question, I think. I think German productions, modern German productions of Shakespeare, would be done more modern German rather than classical German, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Professor Kawai at University of Tokyo feels is driven, according to his own interview, to get precisely, to try to hit the meaning as precisely as possible. And I think collected all of these translations, just of to be or not to be. And in another one of these conversations, I forget who I was talking to, I think Alexa Joubin, but we're talking about how many attempts in a language that has no to be verb. And then Professor Kawai himself also puts forward his translation, which to my sensibility seems very good. I think I was told that even in Chinese also, there's a lack of a to be verb. That's just
But
interesting.
isn't that very difficult though, unless we specify the meaning of to be or not to be to at least something? I mean, to be or not to be itself works in English language, but when you translate that into Japanese language, we need to sort of specify.
Yeah. Are you talking about breathing? Are you talking about suicide? Could it be? And many translators have just said, I have to go in, just like those 18th century editors. I'm going to have to intervene and bring what I think is the closest meaning.
Yes. At the same time, we need to create cultural meaning or add some culturally specific meaning to the play of Hamlet to make the specific line works in whatever version in whatever way that was translated.
Yeah, but I'm thinking of the reverse of that, and just take a very popular animation, Totoro.
Yes.
I saw Totoro dozens of times because my daughter, when she was 5 or 6 years old, I think watched portions of it every day. She loved Totoro and Sailor Moon, and it was in Japanese, and it helped me learn Japanese at the time. Then I saw a version in English, dubbed in English, and I could hear clearly how the difference between the meaning of the Japanese words and how the English just wasn't hitting at the same level. And maybe the translator could have done a little better job or whatnot, but it's very difficult to get the essence of what's happening.
Yes.
And you could say that would even beyond language, the importance of the ofuro, the hot water tub, and Oba-san and the grandmother who tells the kids about the little spirits in the woods and so forth. And this movie being designed for a culture that had felt a separation from their homes, because so many people at that time, back in the 80s, had moved from country to city. And there was a sentimental feeling of wanting to return, even though there's no economy out there.
Yeah.
So all of that, it's hard to translate all of that. And yet Totoro still remains. My students don't know who Bob Dylan is, but they know who Totoro. It keeps on going. So he hit enough universal themes, kind of like Shakespeare did. So if we don't get exactly the jokes between the courtiers at the beginning, or some of the many jokes, we get the general impression of the fact that these young people are fighting for no reason, what Aeschylus calls the airy word born out of just air. And even though we might not know how riotous the London society may have been during the writing of that play, because I think I can track a specific riot in Shoreditch, which would have been close to the Curtain Theater. And I think there was a riot before the production of, not because of Romeo and Juliet, but it was being directly referential to a particular street fight. But I'm not sure yet. It's work in progress. All right. So tell me what you are planning to do in the future as a scholar. What's next on your list of things?
Well, I have two things in mind. The first project would be concerning Shakespeare and the law in the Jacobean period. I mean, the change of legal situation after King James, how it affected Shakespearean plays, and that is something I should be working on the next few years. And another I would say the lighter topic than that would be because I mean we know very little about how Shakespeare was created through printing and book trading in the 17th century. I want to sort of study the specific printers and how they and I mean it might be impossible, but I try to discover why the specific play was chosen to be printed and why and you know what sort of ideas were behind the publication of each play. To King Lear to begin with, and
Yes.
why Nathaniel Butter chose to print the King Lear. That was his first publication, Shakespearean publication, and also he gave it a very curious title, the Master Shakespeare's King Lear. Before, you know, 1597, Shakespeare's name was not on the front page of the Koto. But for some reason, it started appearing in front of the book, which means could signify that Shakespeare's name was saleable. And Nathaniel Butter printed prominently on the top with Master with M added. And well, I want to sort of uncover why this happened and why King Lear was chosen by this particular printers and so forth. So I'm going to write a story of each individuals involved in making of Shakespeare. That's something, the second topic I should be working on.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think the focus on
And
Lear.
these two topics are for mainly Japanese audiences, though. And as a international scholar, I want to keep writing something that is going on in Japan, like Ninagawa Shakespeare or his influences to younger generation and so forth in English. I think that's my job to keep, publicizing about that to the world. So I look to both sides from now on.
Yes, we were talking about Sarah Ollie before. I did the interview with Alexa Joubin. She's someone I'd like to get.
Yeah, she seems to have published a very interesting book on Shakespeare in East Asia. I want to have you read that or?
I have not. It's
book
just
already
out.
published.
It's just out, I think.
Looking forward to reading it.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And also, there's a recent book by Adele Lee, whom I've not met, but it has to do with Shakespeare in Japan and China. And she picked some very large and very uniquely different cultures, but there's some very, very interesting research in that.
When I started studying Shakespeare, I never dreamt of, talking something about Shakespeare to the international audiences. I thought that I was going to teach Shakespeare to the Japanese students, you see, as a means of, introducing Western culture to the domestic audiences. But the things have changed over the 30 years, and I never thought that I was going to be introducing something about Japanese Shakespeare to the worldwide audiences.
That's the history. That's the major period of bringing in the West to make Japan part of the international community by importing and understanding the cultures around them. And I think even in my career, the professors who were older than me, that's basically all they felt they needed to do. But now, because I guess of Japan's prominence, economic and cultural prominence in the world, it attracts scholars who want to pull something back from Japan into their own cultures. So,
and also from the students' perspective, Shakespeare is no longer something that they study by way of studying about Western culture, but they need Shakespeare as a platform of communication, isn't it? I mean, like, because we share the Shakespeare, we are able to share Shakespeare worldwide. I mean, to know about Shakespeare means that they could communicate with others. Shakespeare is no longer an icon of Western literature, but it's already a vehicle of communication with others. So from the
Yeah.
students, they need to learn Shakespeare anyway. And as a
And,
teacher, we need to change our ways of introducing Shakespeare to students.
it's still something we struggle with every year.
Yes.
How can we get better? And we've just been at that time of year where how do I make my class next year better?
I teach Shakespeare for the literature students, but on the other hand, I'm fully in charge of food science students, and I'm organizing English language section of the department. So I'm always trying to connect my Shakespearean background to the education of English language and also food sciences.
Yeah. In fact, years ago, is Professor Ida at Hiroshima University was in our faculty, and he was quickly befriended me and became kind of senpai, and a little bit, he was more advanced. But he told me more than once. He goes, "If you can write the book on Shakespeare and food, that will be a very popular book in Japan." And I never did because I didn't have the resources at that time to research it. And then some people started doing research in that area, probably far better than I could, because it's very difficult to gather from Shakespearean text and then cross-reference what the diets were and so forth. But probably you can assume not very nutritious. And so that was another area, and I'm probably an area that still can be done. That's all very interesting. Are you, just as a sort of final question, have you decided yet? In our case, we're not quite sure how we're going to manage classes. Of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic. For anybody, watching this 5 years from now.
Presently, I try not to think about that. I have been on sabbatical this year.
Oh,
So,
lucky you! Lucky you!
and I will gradually start, thinking about how I teach using this network. And I don't know what the situation after April, but it's going to be a mixture of online classes and also physical face-to-face meeting in the classroom.
We're struggling with some key words more than we are the actual mechanics. And I wish we would start looking more toward the mechanics of what high flex means, or what the hybrid classroom will actually mean. And like, how do you set up your computer and the technology? But that's created, more stress and a stressful time, because we just became accustomed to teaching online. And now they want us to pivot. And this is all across the world. All of this is happening. Everybody's been struck by this. In our university administration, they have really very conscientiously, in their best, everybody's best interest in mind, have tried to set up policies and this and that. And it's just extremely hard for them, and it's extremely hard for teachers, and nobody really knows. And here we are almost a year into it, and we're still in this not knowing, so in the best case scenario, we'll be okay after not so long.
I try to be optimistic in that. And also, because I study Shakespeare, I tend to be flexible. Shakespeare can be appropriated in any forms, our classes could be. This is my room in my house.
You're at home. You're at home now.
Yes. I would have to organize one room specifically for that purpose.
That's right. Well, we live, and we live with people. I have my wife, and she likes to, we're not in a very big place. She likes to walk around and do whatever she does during the day. And I have taught from home when it seemed like it was getting very bad. And I didn't want to, but almost all the way through, except for a lockdown period, we've been able to come into our office. And I find it to be very safe, because they're not bunches of students on campus, and my colleagues are either here or there. There are not a lot of us around. So I've tried to direct as much teaching from right here, where I have my books, where I have all of my records and stuff. And I think you'll find that it's not that hard. I think the hardest part last year is that we were so much in the dark about where things were going.
Mm, mm.
We had, there's a lot of committee work. We're just like everyone else. We have committee works, we have reports, and we have to, and all of that had to be done online. And we had to set up some policies for how we do things. I hosted a couple of lectures, and before we did that, our committee had to write a policy about how to do that and whether or not we were going to do it. And that was a lot of work. And of course, we unlike a lot of other cultures, we set the entrance exam. And if you were on sabbatical, you were freed that obligation last year, right?
Yes, I was.
Yes. Isn't that wonderful? I was on sabbatical last year.
Yeah, but I was supposed to be in Oxford by now and studying for the whole period, but I had to give it up. And
I'm so sorry.
for Japanese professors to have another sabbatical, we need to spend maybe another 10 years or so. So
yeah.
I'm a bit disappointed.
That's sad.
In a small office and always saying, after Richard II, I'm studying how I may compare the prison where I live to the world. And I was always soliloquizing this particular line to myself.
It's just so sad. It's so sad. And there's several opportunities I had to do research last summer, other things that I had to cancel, a couple of conferences. Yes. And I feel bad about that. And then I feel guilty because there are people out there who, have lost their jobs and who've gotten very, very sick. And so I start feeling guilty, but I'm hoping that we're through the worst of this. What I want to repeat is just how much I appreciate you stepping forward, because I've contacted, we were contacting several people. And I think they felt like they had to do an enormous amount of preparation for this. And you don't, we're trying to find out what you have done. And, it's not like a conference where you'd have to do a paper and so forth. But because you've stepped forward, and I think I use the...
But obviously you need a lot of editing from now on.
Well, it is. I think it might be cultural in Japan. There's one place on my walk, when I'm walking outside my school, there's one very narrow street that has a stoplight, and there's never a car on it. And you can see down, but it's a fairly long stop on the sidewalk. And if I'm in a hurry, I just walk across. And I've done that. Don't tell anyone I did that, because that's terrible, because people wait at stops, but and I look behind me, and there people will start following me across. So if we have some leadership here with you, we might get some other people to walk, across what might not be they may sense is dangerous, but which isn't dangerous at all. And so it's just very happy, because I can't do this series without participation from my colleagues here in Tokyo and in Japan. It just wouldn't make sense. That's just what you were talking about earlier.
I'm very sure that a lot of other Japanese professors can make better contributions than I do.
Oh, you're being humble. No, absolutely. I had no idea until I started looking more closely at your work, how much we overlapped in our interest in Shakespeare, and in terms of the reception, 18th century, and the bibliography, and and even the performances and so forth. And it's just been a joy really talking to you with you today about these things. And I'm hoping that that this might continue in some way, that we can continue either doing it like this, or get together for a little conference to discuss.
Yeah, we can perhaps cooperate in our classes maybe, or we exchange our ideas.
Well, I'd be delighted.
We can physically visit each other, because we are teaching at very close institutions.
We are, and if you are able in this kind of format, we can invite you to teach our students something about anything.
I would love to speak to your students on whatever topics that they might be interested in.
We'll see which class it is, and coordinate time schedules and so forth. But my seminar class, in particular, my seminar class, or maybe graduate class, if you're free at the same hour, that would be very easy to set up, and I'm going to teach for maybe 2 or 3 weeks to get comfortable with the students and so forth.
Yes.
But
Yes.
early in the next spring term, if we can, if you will agree, we can have you come in and give us a talk, and it can be really anything.
Yeah, I'd love
We'll
to do
talk
that.
about anything if you're
Yes.
willing.
Yes, I'd love to do that, and I also love to invite you over to my class to do the same.
I would be delighted. I hope that we can come physically, face to face. But
yes.
if not, we can do it this way.
Yes.
And we're able to, now that we have our policy in place, we can. It's easy to do, and it doesn't have to be international people all the time. You know, we need
Or
to.
we could invite other speakers to this session, to our classes, and do a panel and that sort of thing.
That would be wonderful.
Yes.
That would be wonderful to do. Well, let's think about this in the future. Okay,
Yes.
well, what I want to do is make sure that you have a restful rest of your sabbatical. You still have 2 more months or so.
Thank you very much.
To do that, and to thank you so much again, Hiro, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for giving me such a
have
wonderful opportunity today.
Okay, and we have to. We bow to each other here in Japan,
Okay.
and so thank you so much again.